Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
My brother looked me dead in the eye and said, "Christmas is no place for losers. Don't bother showing up." I didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't even flinch. I just nodded, turned around, and left. What he didn't know was that for the past 6 years, I'd been quietly paying for his kids' private school tuition, and I had every receipt to prove it. That was the last time he'd ever get a cent out of me, and he didn't even know it yet. It was December 15th when he said it. I remember the date clearly because I just finished wrapping the gifts I ordered for my nieces and nephews. A mix of books, games, and one particularly overpriced tech gadget for his son Brian, who'd just gotten into some elite science camp in Colorado. I'd sent the payments off without so much as a second thought, as I had every semester since the oldest started private school. I wasn't rich, not in the way people like to show off on Instagram, but I was steady. I had a job that paid well, lived below my means, and never made a fuss. I'd helped because it felt like the right thing to do, because the kids deserved it, and because I still foolishly believed that family came before pride. But that day, with his voice sharp as a slap and his smirk practically daring me to protest, something inside me hardened in a way I didn't expect. The message came through the family group chat like a grenade. My brother, Dean, always had a flair for dramatics, but this time, he really outdid himself. The text read, "Venues all set for the 24th. Reminder, if you didn't contribute, stay home. Christmas is no place for losers." It took a minute before I realized that the text wasn't vague or general. It was aimed directly at me. I hadn't chipped in for the holiday venue, not because I couldn't, but because no one had even told me there was a contribution request. They deliberately left me out, and now they were using that silence as a weapon. I stared at the message for a long time. The rest of the family didn't say a word. No one defended me. Not my sister, not my cousins, not even my own mother. I didn't feel angry at first, more like numb, like I just stepped into an alternate universe where nothing made sense and the people you loved most were total strangers. I typed a single reply. "Understood, wishing you all the best." Then I put down my phone, took a deep breath, and decided that I was done being the silent sponsor of their curated family life. See, Dean had always been the favorite. Tall, charming, great at sports. He was the guy everyone in town thought would end up running for mayor or marrying someone famous. Me, I was the bookish one. I liked art, volunteered at libraries, worked my way through college with scholarships and long nights. When our parents divorced, I was the one who stuck around to help Mom with bills while Dean chased his startup dreams in Austin, then Denver, then LA, leaving behind 2 kids with a woman he eventually divorced. Of course, when he came crawling back to town with nothing but a leased SUV and a brand new wife who insisted on Pilates and Prosecco Tuesdays, the family rolled out the red carpet. What they didn't see was the late-night calls when he begged for help covering tuition, or the way he framed it like a short-term loan he'd totally pay back once that side hustle kicks off. I never asked for a dime back. I just figured, it's for the kids. They shouldn't suffer for their father's pride. And maybe, deep down, I hoped he'd remember that when it mattered. Turns out he remembered nothing but the version of me he wanted to believe. The loser sister who never married, who never flaunted wealth, who didn't fit the country club image he was trying to build. Later that night after the text, I sat in my living room in total silence. I didn't cry, not then. I just kept looking at the wrapped presents on the floor, thinking how weird it was that the only people who'd actually benefit from my kindness were the ones being taught to pretend I didn't exist. The next morning, I got a message from my sister-in-law, Melissa. It was a picture of their family holiday card. Dean, Melissa, Brian, and Katie, all dressed in matching sweaters in front of their decked-out house. It was almost like a stock photo, everything perfectly posed. The message said, "Snapped your card at the studio. You'll love what the kids wrote inside. So sweet." At first, I thought maybe this was some kind of peace offering. I clicked the image and zoomed in. There, in a fake printed script font, was a line at the bottom. "With love, Uncle Dean and Aunt Melissa. Funded by family." I blinked. Was that supposed to be a joke? Was that their way of acknowledging what I'd done? Or worse, mocking it? My name wasn't anywhere on the card, not a mention, not a footnote. Yet my money had paid for every one of those smiles. That's when it clicked. I wasn't family, I was a sponsor. And like any good sponsor, I had the right to stop funding the circus whenever I wanted. So I poured myself a glass of wine, opened my laptop, and started combing through every wire transfer, every bank record, every tuition payment confirmation email. 6 years of quiet generosity, all carefully documented. I put it all in a folder on my desktop and titled it Christmas Cleanup. The name made me laugh harder than I expected. I didn't message anyone. I didn't make a scene. I just watched the clock tick toward the next tuition deadline and made a decision. Let them see what Christmas without a loser really looks like. And just like that, the game began. The first thing people don't tell you about giving without being asked is how quickly it becomes expected, not appreciated. There's a strange shift that happens somewhere between generosity and obligation, and before you even realize it, you've moved from being someone who helps to someone who's simply doing their job, an invisible duty assigned by people who never thanked you properly in the first place. That was my role in the family for years. The quiet fixer, the emergency fund with a smile, the woman who didn't have kids of her own, but somehow always found the money for someone else's. And somehow, along the way, they all stopped seeing me as a person with limits. I became the background character in their life stories, necessary, but not central. But after that message, after being told Christmas was no place for losers, I started replaying everything, every call, every email, every conversation where I said yes when I should have said no, and the picture that emerged wasn't just painful, it was infuriating. 6 years of tuition payments, 6 years of textbook orders, lab fees, school trips, emergency fundraisers, and just this once requests. I'd covered it all without hesitation. It started small. Dean had lost his job after that crypto startup fell through, and the divorce left him with more debts than dignity. He called me late one night, almost in tears, saying he didn't know how to tell his son that he couldn't go back to school after winter break. He sounded desperate, and something in his voice, maybe it was panic, maybe guilt, hooked me. I wired the money the next day. That was the first tuition payment. I didn't tell anyone, not because it was a secret, but because I figured it wasn't something I needed to broadcast. It was family. You help because you can. You don't ask for applause, but maybe you should ask for respect. Over the years, the payments became regular. Every semester, like clockwork, I'd get a vague reminder, usually from Melissa, his wife, saying something like, "Brian's enrollment is due next week. Fingers crossed it all works out." That was code. I was supposed to know what they meant, and I always did. I would log into my bank, send off the money, and move on. There was never a thank you card, never a call of gratitude, never even a forwarded confirmation that they'd received the payment. I only knew it was received because the kids stayed in school and no one panicked again. I think the most bitter part of it all was realizing how much effort I had put into maintaining peace, while they felt completely entitled to ignore my existence the moment it was convenient. I didn't go to every family dinner. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but I was always there, always backing them from the sidelines like some silent shareholder with no voting rights. After that Christmas message, I stopped everything. I didn't call, I didn't explain, I didn't send any reminders. The semester deadline came and went, and I watched silently as the panic started to ripple across the surface. Melissa messaged me 3 days after the tuition due date, her tone panicked but sugar-coated, as if she wasn't sure whether to guilt trip or sweet-talk me. "Hey girl, hope everything's okay. Brian's school is asking about the payment. We figured maybe there was a delay or something. Let us know." I didn't reply. The next day she called. I didn't pick up. Then came the group text again. But this time it wasn't Dean. It was my sister Sharon, who had been quiet the whole time. "I'm not sure what's going on," she wrote, "but Melissa is really stressed. The school called her directly. Are you okay?" I stared at the message for a full minute before typing back, "I'm fine. I just stopped paying, that's all." No one responded. It took less than a week for the polite silence to curdle into chaos. Dean called twice, left voicemails. The first one was measured, polite, like he was trying to pretend we were still on good terms. Hey, I think there might have been a mix-up with Brian's tuition. No big deal, just call me back when you can. The second one, 2 days later, was different. Angry, frustrated. Look, if this is about that Christmas crap, that was a joke. You're being really immature right now. I've got a family to worry about, okay? Don't make this harder than it has to be. I didn't return the call. I didn't even listen to the whole message. I saved it, though, along with all the others. The strange part was how calm I felt. Not vindictive, not smug, just calm. Like I had finally taken my foot off the gas in a car that had been going 80 miles an hour for years. I went back through my records, every receipt, every transaction, and for the first time, I organized them not as proof of my kindness, but as a reminder to myself that I was not insane. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't overreacting. I had been exploited by people who had the audacity to look down on me while living off my income. I was done. The final straw came a few days later when I heard from a mutual friend, one of those old neighbors who still keeps in touch with everyone and somehow knows more than she should. She said she'd overheard Dean at a local bar, bragging to someone about how his sister was basically a walking scholarship fund, and how he didn't have to lift a finger to get the kids into top schools. He said it with pride, like it made him clever. Like I was just a character in his story, a convenient item who didn't need thanks. That was the moment something shifted in me completely. It wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't even about being excluded. It was about being rewritten. My story, my effort, my role in their lives had been twisted into some background narrative that made him look better and me look pathetic. And now that the money was gone, I could feel the scaffolding falling apart. They didn't realize it yet, but the whole illusion, the lifestyle, the fake stability, the bragging rights, had been propped up by my silence. And now I was done being silent. I didn't tell them that I'd also stopped paying for Katie's art classes, or that I'd withdrawn the emergency savings account I set up in their name 3 years ago when Dean said he was rebuilding his credit. I didn't warn them. I didn't owe them that. Instead, I sat back and watched. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's just letting the truth do its work, one unpaid invoice at a time. There's something deeply unsettling about how quickly people shift from taking you for granted to accusing you of betrayal, and yet when you've been the silent support beam of someone else's carefully constructed life for as long as I had been, you come to expect that the gratitude will always dry up before the guilt even sets in. When I stopped paying my brother's bills, when I decided, without rage or spectacle, to quietly extract myself from the financial machinery of his life, I wasn't expecting flowers or apologies. God knows those were never in his nature, but I was, perhaps foolishly, expecting something resembling honesty. Instead, I got panic dressed up as entitlement, and manipulation wrapped in concern. I wasn't the villain, not at first. No, at first I was just being difficult, then emotionally unstable, and within 2 weeks, I had been upgraded to actively trying to ruin his children's future, a leap that didn't surprise me so much, as it revealed exactly how fragile his version of reality had always been. It started with silence, mine. Not the cold shoulder, not the kind of silence that drips with sarcasm or spite, but the kind of silence that unnerves people because it's rooted in finality. I didn't fight him. I didn't scream about the Christmas message or demand an apology. I simply stopped answering. Tuition was due, and I paid nothing. The art classes I used to fund for Katie were up for renewal, and I declined to cover the new term. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't ask for explanations. I allowed the absence of my support to speak in a language they clearly weren't used to hearing, and almost immediately, the cracks began to show. Melissa was the first to pivot. She called me 3 times in one afternoon, each voicemail more polished than the last, her tone walking that fine line between performative concern and veiled irritation. "Hey, just checking in again," she said with a forced laugh that didn't reach her voice. "I hope everything's okay. We're just a little confused on the school stuff, and we know how detail-oriented you usually are." Translation: you forgot your place, and it's making us uncomfortable. I didn't return her calls. I forwarded her last message to a new folder I created on my desktop. One I had started filling with every piece of evidence that told the real story, my story. The receipts, the emails, the bank statements, and now the voicemails. I wasn't planning to use them, not yet. But I was done pretending I didn't need to be prepared. Then came Dean. His first few attempts were standard, mild annoyance disguised as casual conversation, trying to sound like he hadn't noticed anything was wrong. But by the end of the week, his patience wore off. The message he left me on Friday night was longer than usual, his voice tinged with that uniquely masculine blend of frustration and pride. "Look, I don't know what's going on with you, but this isn't how family behaves. You're punishing the kids for something they didn't do, and honestly, it's kind of messed up. I never asked you to pay for anything in the first place." That last line hung in the air like a threat wrapped in denial, because he had asked, many times. In texts, in calls, in late-night desperate emails, he assumed I'd forgotten, but I hadn't. I never forget. I just don't always speak. I saved that voicemail too. By the second week, the calls stopped. Not because they understood, but because they had moved to the next phase of response. Strategy. Sharon, my sister, the one who had always stayed quiet, always hovered on the edges of family drama like a referee no one asked for, texted me. "Hey, I'm not getting in the middle of this, but maybe just talk to him. The kids are confused. Katie cried yesterday because she doesn't know if she can go back to class." It was a gut punch, I'll admit. Not because it made me feel guilty, but because I had spent years making sure those kids never had to know how fragile their father's world really was. And now, within days of me stepping back, that mask was already slipping. Dean hadn't just relied on me. He had built his image on the assumption that I would always be there to patch the leaks. And that's when I realized what I needed to do. Not yell, not confront, but expose. I called my financial advisor and told him I wanted to shut down the education account, the one I had set up under a trust in their name. He asked if I wanted to notify the beneficiaries, and I told him no, not yet. Let the discovery happen slowly. Let them wonder why the automated payments stopped, why the fallback options disappeared. Let the confusion settle into discomfort, and let the discomfort bloom into realization. Because when you build your entire sense of security on someone else's silence, you should probably ask yourself what happens if they ever decide to speak. And then, just as I was settling into the strange calm of being finally fully detached, the letter came. Not a letter, technically. A notice, a formal one, from a local law office I didn't recognize. It wasn't a lawsuit, not yet, but it was a warning. A pre-litigation letter claiming that my decision to halt payments had caused measurable educational disruption to the minors in question, and that if an amicable resolution wasn't reached, next steps would be pursued. It was so absurd I laughed out loud, sitting there in my kitchen, holding a 3-page document that essentially accused me of financial abandonment, of children that weren't mine, under a contract that didn't exist, funded by a promise that had never been written down. But the letter wasn't the part that made my blood run cold. It was the postscript. Handwritten, barely legible. "Please don't let this go too far. We can talk. You know I'm just trying to protect my family." That was Dean's handwriting. He had sent a lawyer to scare me. And when that didn't feel strong enough, he tried to soften it with a personal plea. I poured myself a drink, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Because what Dean didn't understand, what none of them had understood, was that the damage was already done. Not just to our relationship, not just to the kids' schooling, but to the version of me that used to believe forgiveness was automatic and family was forever. The silence wasn't revenge. It was the warning, and now the real consequences were just beginning. There's a particular kind of satisfaction, a rare and oddly serene gratification, that comes not from causing chaos directly, but from stepping away just long enough to let the consequences unfold in your absence, especially when you've spent years being the one quietly keeping the gears turning behind the curtain while others took the applause. I wasn't at the Christmas Eve dinner that year, by choice of course, but I heard everything, every uncomfortable silence, every poorly timed joke, every passive-aggressive dig and awkward deflection, because when a system loses its hidden power source, it doesn't collapse all at once. It trembles, it strains, it makes that long creaking sound, like old wood under too much weight. And then, right when everyone thinks it might still hold, it caves in a way that no one can ignore. Dean didn't understand this. He thought I was bluffing, thought I'd quietly relent once things got hard enough for the kids, or maybe that I'd feel guilty the moment he brought up family legacy or childhood memories. What he hadn't counted on, though, was how much strength comes from being underestimated for too long. It started with a flurry of last-ditch efforts. Dean, who had once proudly declared that he never begged, was suddenly calling everyone we mutually knew, extended family, old friends, even neighbors who barely remembered my name, trying to convince someone, anyone can, to act as a mediator. He told them I was having some sort of mental health crisis, that I'd always struggled with boundaries, and that he just wanted what's best for the kids. That was always his line. He'd wrap his self-interest and concern for his children, wear it like armor, and assume no one would question it. But people started asking questions, uncomfortable ones, the kind he wasn't prepared to answer. Like why, if he had such a steady job and loving family, was I the one paying for everything? Or why I suddenly cut off support after years of consistency? And most of all, why hadn't he told anyone I was the one keeping their finances afloat? He couldn't lie fast enough to cover all the holes. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because the more he talked, the more the truth began to surface on its own. A few days before Christmas, I got a message from Katie, his daughter, 15, sweet, always polite even when the rest of the family forgot how to be human. It was short and carefully worded, like someone else might read it over her shoulder. Auntie, I'm not sure what happened, but I hope you're okay. I miss you. Hope we can talk soon. It broke something in me and hardened something else at the same time. She didn't know, not really. She had been protected from the worst of it, shielded by her father's image and my silence. But the cracks were reaching her now, and for the first time, I saw an opportunity not for revenge, but for revelation. So I sent her a message back. Not bitter, not angry, just factual. Sweetheart, I'm okay. I love you very much. I can't pay for your classes right now because I'm waiting for your dad to talk to me honestly. I hope you understand. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for her to start asking questions at home, ones that Dean couldn't answer without unraveling his carefully curated narrative. From what I later heard, thanks to my cousin Marla, who has never met a family drama she didn't report on in full, the Christmas Eve dinner was an absolute mess. The kids were confused, the adults were tense, and Melissa tried far too hard to overcompensate, which only made the underlying tension worse. Dean, who had always thrived in loud performative family settings, couldn't keep his composure. He snapped at Sharon. He made a snide remark about some people thinking they're better than the rest of us just because they write a few checks. And then when Katie asked him, loud enough for the whole table to hear, why I hadn't been invited, he reportedly stood up, walked outside, and didn't return for 45 minutes. That's when I knew the tide was turning. He wasn't just losing control of the narrative. He was losing control of the one thing he thought he could always rely on, his image. For a man like Dean, perception was everything. He wanted to be the generous provider, the successful brother, the doting father who overcame hard times through grit and charm. He couldn't afford for people to see the truth, that behind the polished photos and exaggerated stories was a man who leaned heavily on someone he never gave credit to, and who dismissed the very person who held up his illusion for so long. But the real shift, the true unraveling, came not from family drama or uncomfortable questions, but from the system itself. the school called. Not to me, but to Dean and Melissa. They were short on the tuition for the spring semester, $13,000, due in full within 2 weeks if they wanted to hold the kids' spots. Dean tried to negotiate. He offered a payment plan. He promised alternative funding. But the school wasn't interested in promises anymore. They wanted cash, or at the very least, a guarantor they could trust. And suddenly, I was no longer answering their emails either. Melissa, desperate, reached out one last time. I know you're upset. I know things were said that shouldn't have been, but we need help. The kids need help. If this is about Dean, just deal with him. Don't punish the kids for his mistakes. I stared at the message for a long time. I wanted to scream, to ask where this energy was when they printed that Christmas card without my name on it, when they let Dean humiliate me in front of the family, when they smiled and nodded as he called me a loser, in the same breath he asked for my money. But I didn't scream. Instead, I wrote back, I'm not punishing the kids. I'm teaching them something no one else in that house has bothered to. Consequences. When Dean decides to speak honestly and publicly about what really happened, I'll reconsider my involvement. Until then, my silence stands. And then I waited, because the next move was his, and I had all the time in the world. Let him sweat, let him squirm, because the truth doesn't always come crashing in. Sometimes it just quietly waits until the lies get too heavy to hold. It wasn't until late January, several weeks after the chaotic Christmas dinner I never attended, and the flurry of calls and messages I continued to ignore, that I finally saw Dean again. Not in person, not at my door or on my phone, but through a video message forwarded to me by Sharon, who, in one of her rare moments of clarity and nerve, had decided to record what she called the implosion of the golden child, during a moment she clearly wasn't supposed to witness. The video wasn't long, just under 3 minutes, filmed awkwardly with one hand while the camera remained hidden under a folded napkin on the corner of the kitchen table. But what it captured was more than any confrontation or dramatic outburst ever could have offered. It was Dean, my brother, the man who had once lectured me about the importance of appearances and family unity, talking to Melissa in a strained whisper, as if afraid that someone might be listening in from the hallway. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in spirit, like the weight of every unpaid debt, every lie told to keep the illusion alive, was finally settling on his shoulders in a way even he couldn't shrug off. What struck me most wasn't the anger in his voice or the desperation in his tone. It was the fear, the unmistakable anxiety of a man who realized too late that the only person who ever truly held his chaos together had stepped away, not out of anger, but out of certainty that there was nothing left worth salvaging unless he chose to be honest. He was saying things like, I thought she'd cave by now, and I didn't think she'd actually cut it all off. And how the hell am I supposed to explain this to the kids without looking like a complete fraud? And Melissa, never one to mince words when backed into a corner, snapped back. Then maybe you shouldn't have treated her like she was disposable. I watched that clip 5 times, not because I enjoyed it, though in some cold and distant way, it was satisfying to hear the panic behind the arrogance, but because it was the first real evidence I had that my silence had become more powerful than any confrontation could have ever been. Dean was unraveling, not because I had exposed him, but because he was finally seeing himself through the lens of someone who stopped believing his excuses. In the weeks that followed, the fallout came in fragments, as all reckonings do. The school didn't budge. Without the payment, Brian's enrollment was suspended, and Katie's art scholarship was downgraded to partial assistance, requiring a significant parental contribution that Melissa, despite her best efforts to maintain composure, admitted to Sharon was impossible to meet. The family, once loyal to Dean by default, began asking questions that had never been asked before. My aunt called, clearly uncomfortable, trying to piece together the gaps in the story she had been told. I didn't realize you were the one paying for all that, she said cautiously, her tone laced with the kind of guilt that only comes from realizing you were complicit in someone's mistreatment. Even passively, I didn't scold her. I didn't point fingers. I simply confirmed the truth and let her sit with it. Eventually, Dean reached out. Not through a message, not through a call, but by showing up at my front door on a rainy Thursday afternoon, looking soaked and hollow, his confidence worn down to nothing. I didn't open the door right away. I watched him through the peephole, standing there with his hands in his coat pockets, like a teenager who'd been called into the principal's office and wasn't sure how much trouble he was really in. When I finally opened it, I didn't invite him in. I didn't smile. I didn't offer coffee or kindness. I just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for him to say something that didn't sound like a line rehearsed in the car. He started to talk, but I stopped him. "I'm not interested in apologies that are more about making you feel better," I said flatly. "I'm only interested in the truth." He nodded slowly, his eyes tired in a way I hadn't seen before. And then he said it. Not with flair, not with tears, but with the kind of raw simplicity that tells you a person has finally dropped the act. "I used you. I did it because I thought you'd always let me. I thought you didn't need thanks, and I convinced myself that I was doing it for the kids, but really, I was doing it to maintain an image I knew I couldn't afford. And when you stopped, I didn't know how to handle it because I never expected you to stop." There it was, not redemption, not closure, but recognition. And while it didn't fix everything, because some fractures go too deep for quick repairs, it was enough to shift the balance. I didn't forgive him that day, not fully, not with open arms and holiday invitations, but I did take a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months, and I let him talk. Not because he deserved it, but because I needed to hear the truth spoken aloud. Not for vindication, but for the record. We didn't hug. We didn't make plans to reconcile. He walked away that day knowing that the narrative had changed, that his story now included a chapter where the sister he called a loser turned out to be the only adult in the room. And as I closed the door behind him, I felt no smug sense of triumph, just a deep, resonant calm that comes from knowing you finally stood up, not in a blaze of fury, but in the quiet certainty that you deserved better. That night, I took out the old Christmas card from the year before, the one with their matching sweaters and the line that said, "Funded by family." And I folded it carefully, placed it in a drawer, and left it there, not as a souvenir of pain, but as proof of how easily people forget who held them up until the scaffolding is gone. I don't know if Dean and I will ever be close again. I don't know if the kids will forgive him or me or either of us, but I do know this. I stopped being their silent benefactor, and in doing so, I finally stopped being invisible. And in the quiet space that followed, I became something far more powerful than they ever expected. I became free.